I would like to introduce Gabriel Leif Bellman, and today we'll hear a timely talk of his on writing truth in a year of fiction. Our presenter is a true Renaissance man, something I have always aspired to be. Not only is Gabriel a lawyer and mediator, but he's also a film director, an opera composer, and a playwright. He helped initiate the MTV True Life series and co-founded the San Francisco Frozen Film Festival, which promotes independent filmmaking. His other occupations have included high school teacher, umbrella salesman, dishwasher, lumber feeder, slam poet, and Irish circus carny. His academic degrees are from USC Film School, NYU, and UC Hastings, which has also produced our Vice President-elect, Kamala Harris, and my own daughter, Bria. Now, we all look forward to writing truth in a year of fiction. Welcome to you, Gabriel Bellman.
Thank you, Roberta. Thanks for the wonderful introduction, and thanks to everyone for making time on this day, Sunday, where we have a regime change at work that I think is sort of part of the reason that the previous year potentially could be considered a year of fiction. But I think I want to talk a little bit about a little history about some of that. And then hopefully there'll be time for questions. I'm going to try to thread a little bit of an instructional as well as the role of the artist in the world today. So I'm a lawyer, and so I'm trying to synthesize both halves of my brain, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. And you can see the slide okay? The slide change? Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of news as entertainment. And again, I'm going to delve lightly into a number of topics today. But I think as we looking at the idea of fiction and nonfiction, these concepts I think are particularly relevant in the arts, but in culture and in society today, it's quite relevant. So you can look at sort of some of this idea of the news as storytelling. I mean, it goes back, the invention of the newspaper. I think if you look at sort of the trauma of World War II and some of the updates about World War II, there was potentially a pattern of looking to a nightly news for some assurance from newscasters and whatnot, but it was a 1 a day or 2 a day, maybe check-in. Check in the morning, make sure nothing crazy happened, check in the evening before bed or after dinner, and that was it. It wasn't until the 1980 when CNN started that there was this appetite for a 24-hour news cycle tapped into by journalists, by storytellers. So if you're looking at the idea of news as entertainment, as a consumable item for people's attention, of course, there's always been perspectives from the storyteller, right? This way a story is written characterizes your view of the characters. The idea of a person who struggles between their better half and their worse half and ultimately is redeemed upon helping their child is one way to view the story of Darth Vader. The story of somebody who, builds a Death Star, destroys and murders millions of innocent people by blowing up planets, and that the last man is exposed is another view of Darth Vader. So it really depends on the person telling the story, partly how the viewer and the listener or the reader experiences the information. And so I want to say a little bit about, and so CNN sort of created this network that was in part a response to the appetite for people to constantly have an update. In a world where really things don't change much faster than they changed 100 years ago, the idea that you would need to be refreshed constantly, and of course now we have Twitter and internet, which allows for even more faster refreshes than you see companies that are forced to change their bylines or their images, in some cases every minute to keep people where their money is made, right? Which is based on, now it's based upon views and refreshes and clicking versus it used to be just you'd sell it once, or in the in the 60s and 70s, it was you had the news that was considered part, if you go back far enough, part of the salesmanship of televisions to begin with was that you'd maybe get also this bonus hour in which you could then receive news in, and so that was part of what sold televisions to begin with. So there is this relationship between entertainment and news that goes back before. So if you, in this part of the point of our talk today, 1995, you had something called Fox News created. And I can tell you my personal experience there. I was taking a class from the LA Times Pulitzer Prize winning writer Howard Rosenberg on media criticism. And we got these advanced tapes in 1994 about this new show. And we reviewed a number of new shows for class. It was assigned to us. And this idea of this new show was called Fox News. Now, the response of the students uniformly across the board was, this has to be some kind of a joke, right? This is not news. It came from a very slanted political perspective. For those who don't know the history of Fox, it was created by a Republican operative who was angered at some of the reporting on big corporate malfeasance by CNN and other, news organizations, which it didn't used to be called liberal news. It was just news because they reported facts, but because those facts were harmful to big corporate interests, he thought, maybe I could do something to counteract the negative impact because it was hurting the shares of some of the companies. And so he created this very overproduced, very slick show and they called it Fox News. And at the time, nobody took it very seriously. And we reviewed it in class and sort of had a big laugh and said, well, that's pretty far from what anyone has ever considered news in this country. And nobody's going to go for this. It had the big dun, 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 and Hollywood production values. It was scored. They put a ton of money into Foley artists and effects. And so the impact was, instead of having, Walter Cronkite stand in front of a camera and say, well, the fire in Santa Rosa is 84% contained today. It was death by fire. Who survives? And of course, it was much more attractive to viewers than previous news. And so what happened a year later when Fox News was launched is, to the surprise of many, it was very popular because it contained so much in the way of music and visual effects. And so it really impacted the way all journalism now is, which is to say, it's not that it's reporting different information, it's just reporting it from a perspective, and in the case of Fox News, from a very right-wing perspective, but from the perspective that the story is the most important thing you'll ever see. And it turns out that actually makes people want to see the news more. And so this was the context when I went to work for MTV. And I'll talk a little bit about that before I switch slides. The reason why context matters, right? The reason why it matters, whether you're showing the perspective from the perspective of the corporate interests or the perspective of those who are harmed by the corporate malfeasance, is the meaning changes, right? And so we talk a little bit about, there's a big disconnect in this country about the way we view information. And a lot of times it's the same information, but how it's filtered, it totally changes the meaning. And the reason I'll talk a little bit, because our talk today is about writing. Let's go to something that we're all pretty familiar with, I assume, which is The Road Not Taken, the famous Robert Frost poem. And I think if you look towards the end of the poem, right? Two roads diverge in a yellow road, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down in one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. And we say, like 60 years ago in January, Robert Frost got to read a couple poems at a presidential inauguration. And so he was, by all intents, one of the most famous poets in American history. And so, but I think the understanding of his poem here probably goes to the very last sentence, where two roads diverge in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And I think that we tend to understand the meaning of that as, you should do what you want, and that makes all the difference to take the one, to go your own way. And we have this particularly American individual view of this poem, which is that it celebrates individualism and tells you to just make your own path. But what's really important here is the line right before that, which is usually left out when people are quoting it, which is, I should be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverge in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all of the difference, right? So this is not a poem about the celebration of going your own way. This is a poem, everyone is entitled to their own view of what poetry means to them. But I see this poem as a very, a very sad tale of the fact that you can only do one thing at a time in this life. And so, what you do, it determines your life and your reality. And that's a sad thing. There's a side there. That's not I shouldn't be telling this with a gleeful smile. This is not something that we're so excited about. So yes, we get to do whatever we want with our lives. And in a way, like, we can only do one thing at a time. So you're going to have two choices in your life, and you get to live out the life that you choose, but you only get to do it once. And so I think that's an important thing to remember, that, you can report the information and it means something very different depending on what you leave out. Right? We leave that sentence out when we try to tell people that you should just do whatever you want and that'll be the best choice. We add that in, we say, well, you're going to regret no matter what you do, really, because that's the way life is. So going back even previously to how we documented truth in this country and in worldwide media, we go back to 1922, sort of the invention of the documentary film. You go back to the history of cinema, and we have Nanook of the North, directed by Robert Flaherty, which is documented Eskimo life, but has been recently really criticized because they say it turns out a lot of the killing of the whale and some of the things that were documented. This is one of the very first films, right? The very first documentary film by all accounts, and they were recreating things for the camera, right? So this is Schrodinger's cat situation, where when we by documenting things, does that very act itself change the reality that we're documenting? And you can see this very closely in the way that people respond to cameras in this country. If you go back and look at early camera footage of people being interviewed by newscasters, they almost always looking right at the newscaster, right? They're not savvy to know that there's an audience. Listen, they'll give the newscaster an honest answer, and it's usually pretty boring. Wow, what did you think of that fire? Oh, I'm glad I got out okay. And they just look at them and like, okay, and that's it. And so you won't see a lot of like eloquent, like, and now now when you see reporting on a fire, right? You go, what do you think of the fire? Right into the camera. This was one of the most tragic events that ever happened to Mike, and they're ready with a very canned story because they know exactly what newscasters want to air, right? They want to air a cohesive, interesting story. And when you just give information and it's not in that format, it's not as compelling for viewers. So they're less likely, so there's a combination of editing, right? The newscaster is not going to use something that's not engaging. And so then we have self-editing where people aren't going to tell things now to newscasters because they know that's not going to be aired anyway. So we have this now whole entire generation that is raised on the idea that there's an audience expecting something to mean something that they verbalize. And so this is, does that mean that it's true? Are they the best equipped to come to that conclusion? This might be the only generation since the French Revolution to believe that they know more than experts about issues. Right, so these are, you get someone's opinion about something and they tell you like, well, this is what I think. And the idea that opinions are equal is a very, very new idea. And it's not something that anyone really took seriously other than trying to, overthrow elites during populist movements, which arguably we're seeing some of the effects of now. So, I went to work for MTV in the late 90s during some of this initial movement just after Fox News was created. And I worked in the MTV news department in Times Square, New York City. And what I worked on was a very unknown show with a group of people, journalists. It was called True Life. First it was called True Life. It was called Unfiltered, and then it was called True Life. And it was really just this critical idea that we would send cameras out to individuals, have them document stuff that was interesting, and then they'd send the footage back to us. We would edit it together and see if people liked it. Now we chose, because of the 4 people that I was working with to start this show, we chose subjects like meth addiction, giving up a baby for adoption, and what we were mostly they were journalists or people that had been well educated and got to choose these stories, and at the time we had these arguments, with the executives that would say basically nobody's going to watch people filming themselves. Like, that's ridiculous. People expect like a professional looking clear shot that is really clean and clear. And we say, well, the 1960s, new wave French cinema, Breathless, like people had some experience looking at handheld kind of jiggly cameras. And you could even make the argument that for some people that made it a more personal viewing. Now, of course, the argument about whether people would watch something that was filmed by a person and not by a professional with a camera with a still shot has been settled a few years later than that, but by the creation of YouTube. So I like to think we were right in our arguments that if the information that you captured was interesting enough, people would watch it. And I think now people expect it. And in fact, I would say most, but many people who create supposedly true, video replications, they try to actually replicate that by showing movement and maybe put the camera in the hand of like somebody who's pretending to be in something. So we now have, this idea that professional storytelling now mimics really amateur storytelling, and the more you can make it look amateur and unprofessional, the more people will respond to it. And so, this is sort of what is the role of the artist in society, is that, and there is this idea that what I'm talking about mostly is propaganda, when you're talking about putting spin on media. Now, is that propaganda in and of itself is not negative. Of course, if your goal is to sort of unmask evildoers, then that's probably a good thing. If your goal is to support corporate interests, and to a certain extent, all media companies have sort of corporate interests, then you start to come up with different and potentially challenging ethical questions. But I think aside from all these things, I also want to just highlight the role of the artist in society, which, there is a role for art that, in a world where people are looking to true or sort of news for many of what they find interesting in their storytelling. So there is still, even in the news reels that we look at, we still are moved and drawn towards the stories that we still have always been drawn by in societies, right? This is the Joseph Campbell's myth, the hero of 1,000 faces. If you look, all of the stories, the story of somebody going out and overcoming adversity, right? If you look at the story of Kamala Harris, which was a lot of people responding to from the last 48 hours, the story of somebody who starts with very little and then through their grit and determination brings back to their community real change. Like this is a story that resonates in all of the arts. And so it's not, you don't have to work in news media to work on these stories. And in fact, usually you don't. And so I have a quote here from Charles Bukowski, just remind us all, like, we are all capable of making and creating art, and we should do so. So, who does a lot of the art making in society these days? Well, going back to the idea of fiction, nonfiction, sort of the initial definition of fiction is like something invented or imagined in the mind. It comes from Latin, fingere, which is to form out of clay. So to make something out of nothing, right? So this idea of fiction goes back to at least the 1500s, much longer than that. But the first use of the term nonfiction, the idea that you would have a story or make some kind of a tale that was not imagined or didn't have some element of authorship to it, it's really pretty recent. And it doesn't show up until the 1900s. Whereas in the 1520s, we were talking about the fiction of law. And I can speak to that as a lawyer. So this idea of lawyers and writers, I think, goes back at least 500 years. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because as a lawyer, I think it's important to know that some of those who have played the role of arbiters of language in our society were the first lawyers, right? Going back to the Romans, this idea that you'd have a republic and people would have a role in shaping the world they lived in is part of the role of lawyers, right? They're going to determine the world we live in the society based upon a relationship to property, based upon a relationship to criminal behavior, based on a relationship to things that we promise to do for each other. And also artists, right? Artists have just as much of a role to play in the society we live in. And so we sometimes speak very differently, like, well, there's the sort of this element of society who are the rule makers, and there's the element who are the rule breakers or challenge the norms. But when you combine both those halves, you tend to have a society that's very functional, right? And tension is drawn out by artists to areas that need to be changed by lawyers. But there's been a lot of crossover. If you look at W.H. Auden, a poet is before anything else, a person passionately in love with language. That sounds very much like a lawyer if you've studied the law. If you look at Edgar Allan Poe, the poetry of words is the rhythmical creation of beauty. That's a judge talking about a decision, right? Or that's the way people talk about Supreme Court decisions. Sometimes, a terrible decision, or versus one that is has a beauty in its analysis. And so the idea that, there's a combination between the poets and lawyers, I think, is something I wanted to highlight. And you have lawyers who were poets, Wallace Stevens, E.E. Cummings, Goethe, and then you have poets who wrote extensively about the law, Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Shelley. I think this has moved since the 1970s. There's actually been an awareness of this a little bit in law schools. And some universities actually teach courses now on poetry in the law, because you have, in the study of the law, obsession with language. And, if you're looking at, you're about to see probably in the coming weeks, this obsession with, election laws. And people might, have arguments about like a comma or a period, and whether somebody was 8 feet away or 4 feet away, whether that constitutes, disruption. And so this is very much going to be a language argument, which you would also find in a graduate course on poetry. And so just highlighting the similarities there, And if you look at this poem from Wallace Stevens, 20 men crossing into a bridge into a village are 20 men crossing 20 bridges into 20 villages, or one man crossing a single bridge into a village. This is old song that will not declare itself. 20 men crossing a bridge into a village are 20 men crossing a bridge into a village. That will not declare itself, yet is stern in meaning, as meaning. The boots of the men clump on the boards of the bridge. The first white wall of the village raises through fruit trees. What was it I was thinking? So the meaning escapes. The first white wall of the village, the fruit trees. So this is a poem, but it contains in it, right, a legal question, like when 20 men cross a bridge into a village, is that 20 bridges because 20 men cross them? And so you start to see these playing with language and the importance, of course, because when you look at any serious legal issue, like does the Second Amendment allow for people to carry firearms? Well, it depends on if you believe on your view about the comma and whether or not standing army, standing militia. And so it all depends on the arguments of language, the rights that we hold in our society. And so why write though? Why be a creator of language? Why use, this is all kind of talking a little bit about how we come to like storytelling and how we come to fiction and nonfiction, and a little bit about language. But now I want to talk a little bit why it's important to actively participate in creating art in our lives. And could be journaling. This could be, doing an improv class. This could be making up a song on a piano. So there's something about that's cognitively strengthening that we've learned in the last 10 years about the process of writing. And it's pretty incredible, honestly, the science behind it. So what we found is that music and poetry tend to trigger emotion in the right hemisphere of the brain. And so you get a dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex boost. What's important about that? Well, that's the part of the brain that is the opposite side of the brain that tends to be judgmental and critical, which tends to be overrepresented in highly intelligent people. Everybody here is highly intelligent. At least we all test well. And so it's extra important, I think, for those who have very critical thinking skills to also use exercises that also develop the other side of their brain. And the way that they found this is they had people play jazz music while they were in an MRI, functional MRI machine, and they had people play notes off a page. And the opposite side of the brain of prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral, was lit up when they were playing jazz because it was improvised and they had to create it as they went along. It was actually the alternate side that was lit up when they were playing classical music. And the music sounded wonderful to whoever's listening. But so the idea that how we're creating something, same was true for freestyle rapping versus people who were singing songs that they knew the lyrics to. And so they saw this boost in the side of the brain. And so important also is that it strengthens the bonds in the brain's language center. It boosts memory long-term, which is important as we age. And it lights up daydreaming areas, allows for more creativity. Another interesting article about why it's important to engage in storytelling and also kind of blurs the line between fiction and nonfiction is memory, which is just a little side note. Memory, as we know, as we learn more and more, is very imperfect. People can have false memories. Particularly interesting is that when someone's listening to a story, if you put two people in an MRI machine and had someone telling a story, and a good storyteller, not true for ones that are not so good, but if you've ever had a professor that was incredible at lecturing, or you've seen a TED Talk where they really knocked your socks off, as they tell these stories, which Steve Jobs, Obama, some of the great storytellers are able to enact this, is you can actually see the person who's listening and the person who's telling the story, their brains start to sync up and match up in the same way, so that the memory is the same in the person hearing it as they are telling it. And so this is one theory as to why there are a lot of misremembered facts, because for the person who's undertaking the experience of being a part of the audience, when it's really good, they actually have the same experience as the person who told the story. And this may explain why some people remember things that they think happened to them, because for their brain, it actually did happen to them the same way as the person telling it. So if you were in a impressionable time in your life and you listen to someone tell an exciting story that just happened to them, years later, your brain will look at it the same way, whether you listened to it or whether you told it. And so there's lots of new research being done on that. But what an amazing thing that our brains, as audience or as listeners, can actually have the same experience as someone who's recollecting what exactly happened. so we can actually kind of experience. And that's one of the reasons why we love probably the arts so much, is it gives us the actual same experience of things that can happen to us. So that was my, I think I'm coming in about halfway through the hour on that, which is hopefully what my target was. I thought I'd end with like a reading from my most recent book, which is called Nonfiction and Other Fiction. I wrote this, I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago. No idea, but it's around there. It's prior to the obsession with fake news. I've been interested in this idea of storytelling, however you call it, and so I realized I don't have a physical copy of my book, so I was able to pull it up on my iPad, and I'll read from that. So this is just the first story in the book, called Rainbow, and it's free via Amazon because they give you a free preview. But if you're interested, feel free to order it. But if you don't order it and you're liking this talk, maybe order something from somebody else. I think it's important to support arts and the artists. So please do find an independent artist to support. And that would be my joy if you're able to do that, if you're taking something away positive from this. It doesn't have to support me, but I'd love it if you supported somebody. So this story is called Rainbow, and I'll just read it. He had a rainbow stuck in his hair and he tried to brush it out, but it just turned his comb red and yellow and purple. He asked his chiropractor about it. Your third chakra is out of alignment. What about the rainbow in my hair? His chiropractor handed him a stick of gum. Here, Mr. Rainbow in your hair, chew on this. He took the gum and blew a bubble as he walked down the street. People smiled at him and a kid walking by reached his hand up as if he could grab the rainbow. Don't bother, kid. It's stuck in there. You can't take hold of a rainbow. He wasn't entirely upset. It didn't look terrible, although he would have been happier if it was a little more centered. As it was, it jutted out of the right side of his hair, and the rainbow ended at about a foot behind him, floating in the air like rainbows do. He knew it was just an optical illusion caused by the conflux of precipitation splitting light into the prism of colors that were currently stuck to the side of his head. He just wasn't sure how it got there. Was it something he ate? Were there reasons that the fates had conspired to awaken him on this December morning with a rainbow in his hair? He asked his ophthalmologist about it. You know, you have a bit of astigmatism. What about the rainbow in my hair? His ophthalmologist handed him a pair of glasses. Here, Mr. Colorful Pretty Rainbow Hair, wear these when you read at night. He took the glasses and put them on. The world looked bigger and fishbowled. He passed his own reflection and the rainbow against his head looked bigger, so he took the glasses off and put them in his shirt pocket. An old woman walked up to him. Oops, hold on. And now reading from a tablet as it falls asleep. An old woman walked up to him. Young man, you have a rainbow in your hair. Tell me about it. I've already been to my back and eye doctors. You just need a little bit of lemon juice. Here, let me. The old woman licked her finger and proceeded to smear her saliva against his head. He tried to cringe away, but she held him like a grandchild with gunk in his eye. It tickled a little. She stopped. I have to pick up some lotion, and she left him. The rainbow's still there. He tried not to think about it. It didn't hurt. It didn't feel like anything, really. It was like a freckle. He started to think about what it would be like if he couldn't get it off, how they would treat him at job interviews. He imagined what they would ask. Sir, do you have any experience with C++? Yes. Do you have a rainbow stuck to your hair? Yes. They probably wouldn't say it outright due to discrimination laws and all that, but they sure wouldn't hire him. How could they trust him with a computer or a spreadsheet if he couldn't take care of one of Mother Nature's beautiful creations stuck to his head? He asked his ornithologist about it. The Canadian geese are spectacular this time of year. I recommend a vacation in Nova Scotia to truly see the geese. What about the rainbow in my hair? His ornithologist handed him a field guide to North American geese. Here, take this with you when you go to Nova Scotia, Mr. Colorful Spectrum Hair. He took the field guide and left the office. He was reading about the migratory patterns of the bluebird when he got an itch on the top of his head. He scratched it and the rainbow dislodged itself and started to float away from him. Instinctively, he reached for it, tried to grab it. He was going to miss it. He had gotten used to it. It was beautiful. The sunlight was sparkling on it and it looked like a miracle the way it burned its colors in the sky, and he tried to grab it, but his hands just squeezed through it like it was smoke, and before he had a chance to pull out a plastic bag to toss over it, it was gone. Hey, look at that rainbow, a woman was telling her boyfriend across the street. Isn't it beautiful? The couple was kissing and he looked up at the rainbow. He felt like yelling at them that it was his rainbow they were kissing about, but he didn't. He pulled out his comb, still streaked with its radiant colors, and he rubbed it in his hand. It must have been a karmic lesson, he figured, about how you can't pick your miracles and about how the ethereal, fleeting nature of beauty. He felt a deep depression, and he wanted to take a nap. He would have cried about it, but wasn't this the result he had wanted? Didn't he want the rainbow out of his hair? He was so confused he went into a restaurant and ordered some French fries. Anyway, he concluded at last, dipping into the ketchup and chewing a greasy finger food. The comb was pretty. It had a new shine to it. Maybe it was the reds or maybe it was the blues, but in that moment, it was beautiful. All right.
Wow. Well, Gabriel, you have a rainbow in your hair, and I would hire you in an instant. So thank you so much. That talk is so inspiring, and I think it will help each of us to spark our own creativity. And I know that Michael Eager has a question for you. Michael, will you please unmute and ask your question for Gabriel?
Sure. Hi, Gabriel.
Hey,
I had some questions, what your thoughts were. You mentioned propaganda, you mentioned a number of other things. We seem to have a rise of US government propaganda, where in the past we had spin. Every president likes to present things in the best light, but we now have a fair amount of real propaganda, false or distorted statements.
Yeah. Well, I mean, do I have comments about it? I think the Washington Post has done a pretty good job documenting over 22,500 falsehoods in the last 3 years by the current administration. I think that number is pretty staggering. And I agree that I think in the past, you know, politics by its very nature, I think contains a lot of bluster. And so I think you're seeing, you know, potentially some poor segments of society that don't seem to be bothered by untruths the way that we have come to expect people to be. And I think there's been a shift in reporting about it. I do think there, you know, going back to the creation of Fox News, this idea that if you tell a story, you know, very differently, potentially the untruths will be ignored, right? So I think if you agree, I think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing the result of years of sort of the right potentially waging war with science. We've seen an attempt to discredit science really since if you look at the Powell doctrine going back to the 70s. There was this idea that, you know, voters and young individuals and academics who, you know, had the facts on their side. At that point, there had never been anyone who had challenged, you know, university professors on their opinions, and that was actually, you know, considered, you know, during the Nixon administration, they would never have thought to try to challenge, you know, what professors in universities were saying. And I think the right at that point saw their future, the writing on the wall, and they did go out of their way to sort of start the process of creating think tanks that would kind of muddy the issue, so that if you saw this is what leads to global warming, they could point to experts, and I use experts loosely, but they could point to, you know, institutes that were created as a way to sort of say, well, on the one hand, there's this, but on the other hand, there's this. Now, of course, those who study, you know, gravity think that no matter whether you believe in gravity or not, when you walk off the building, the same thing's going to happen to you. And so I do see it as a problem, the fact that there is, you know, this sort of natural urge, I think, on the part of intelligent people to look at both sides of an argument when many times there's not both sides to gravity, right? Gravity is a theory, and maybe over time we'll have more information that allows us to build on that theory. But for now, it's a very useful way to describe what happens to objects in motion as they walk off a building. So yeah, I think I share probably inherent in your question some concern over like a world where, you know, we can have a press conference held by current administration where they just say stuff in reality, and then a number of people believe what they're saying. I think that's makes the role of journalism much more important. It makes, it makes protecting, our news sources more important, but we've also seen a decline in reading of paper news. We've seen a number of journalists lose their jobs and be discredited because of the shift to a digital centered commerce. And so that you have a perfect storm in a way of, less journalists are employed full time. The ones that are sort of forced to, the ones that have made it through the first round of cuts are both the highly respected ones and the ones who are not respected whatsoever, but have large followings. And so you've gotten rid of all of the middle ground of just your career journalists who in sheer numbers would overwhelm a falsehood by reporting it in all the local papers. And I think there is a trust of local news that has retained since the last generation, because these are people that a lot of families have relationships with. They see them in their home, they're members of their community. And I think you see a distrust of national news, and we've gotten rid of a lot of the local journalists as a society. So I think, you wonder where that's going to come back from. I mean, it's sort of ironic that, Amazon had to buy the Washington Post to keep it from going under. So and I think that plays into some of the ability the article. It's so that's Jeff Bezos, right? So that again, if you have a society where corporate interests are as powerful, that it was an important move for his administration to start off by attacking the media with the vengeance, which is what happened, and many moves towards unfortunate moves against democracy itself. So I'm reluctant to use hyperbole in talking about Nazi Germany and things like that, but I think when you see these moves away from free information and the sort of whataboutism that you have, I think this is a real problem. And yeah, I think that's a good question.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. I have a question. A couple of years ago, San Francisco Regional Mensa heard Phil Matier speak, who's a San Francisco editor and journalist, and he said that now there are three parties in American politics: Republican, Democrat, and celebrities. And one good thing is that Kanye has conceded, but how does the American public try to control the narrative on the influence of celebrities in politics?
I mean, that's a great question. I think part of what we see, in a society this is not a monarchy, and so you can make the argument that the celebrities are sort of the philosopher kings of our society, and they carry as much sort of cultural weight as monarchy does in England, for example. If you look at the role of Prince Charles, it's very similar to the role of Princess Diana and the role of Kim Kardashian. You can make a case that it's about the same amount of weight. They're not exactly engaged in creating government regulations, but they can shift opinion on any issue. So I mean, there's another theory that is the rise to the sort of current administration is this. There was inevitably going to be a celebrity, sort of president at some point. You see the movement towards that with Jesse Ventura and the governor of California, who was governor when I graduated from law school. I don't think people think that Arnold Schwarzenegger, based upon his body of work, was best suited to make laws in California. But celebrity has always been an element in politics, right? And this would be going back to thousands of years, really. Pythagoras was such a celebrity that he ended up running a Roman, country. He ended up running a government and failed spectacularly. But his math was so good, we still remember him, but we don't remember him as the politician. But there's always been a move to get people that were pretty famous for something or other in charge of everybody. I think that's just a natural human tendency to look for success and believe that it sort of transcends specialty. You know, I mean, you look at the people that they've appointed to run things, and I think the argument that there's a swamp or that people who are embedded, I think something that they've studied their whole career are worse at something is an argument that you'd be worse at something if you've done it for a long time, I think. So yes, I think you can't ignore the celebrity aspect to the sort of modern populism, or however we see it.
Great. Thank you for the historical perspective on that. Fran, you had a question about the fairness doctrine. Would you like to ask your question, please?
Gabriel, would you please comment on the role of the impact of the FCC's fairness doctrine being eliminated and the impact of that elimination on two issues? One, the rise of infotainment being fueled by confirmation bias, and two, the decline of critical thinking skills in the general population.
That's a tough question. I don't know if I'm equipped to answer. I haven't studied the FCC regulations very much. Are you referring to the equal time, like to both candidates?
Right.
I mean, I think part of the reason, and I'm not an expert, my understanding is part of the reason they got rid of it is it's really hard to enforce, right? If you had people going on Saturday Night Live, if you have people going on, you know, shows, I thought.
Well, the fairness doctrine never took into account and never addressed and never prohibited any kind of, well, in the copyright law, things like would be the fair use doctrine, or things like parody was always permitted.
Right.
The whole idea that if you were going to be presenting political commentary, you had to present both sides. Many people speculated the FCC's elimination of the fairness doctrine rules basically led to the creation of things like Fox News and the increased polarization on cable news in general. You know, without the elimination of the fairness doctrine, we would have never had one-sided cable news.
Okay, fair enough. I don't know the background on the fairness doctrine, so I appreciate you adding that in. I can speak to the creation of Fox News just because we did, you know, review it at the beginning. And I think I don't think we thought it was actually going to be picked up for syndication. So they did like 4 episodes, and I think it was like any other show where you create a pilot for it, and it just seemed like, well, who's going to watch this? Like, it was so blatantly politically oriented towards corporate interests at a time when, you know, when corporate interests were not that popular. So it was, you know, you're talking about the Clinton era, right? So it just didn't seem like something that would have an audience. And so I think, you know, in retrospect, just like, you know, the current president, who nobody took seriously either. I think these things after the fact it seems like, wow, that was something that, you know, I think it's up to academics to decide why it happened, but there's no doubt it happened. I mean, the current administration received the second most votes in American history, luckily or unluckily, I assume everybody here is of a certain political persuasion, but, you know, luckily the first most was Joe Biden. But I think, you know, how did that person receive that many votes is a mystery. How did Fox News get picked up, and why did people watch it is a mystery. I think, I mean, I'm making some general theoretical guesses, which is that I think it was very persuasive, but there's, you know, people have made very persuasive blockbuster films that have tanked as well. So something about Fox News and the role of fear in the way that they report things has really latched on, and I think that remains true. So it may very well be that people growing up not having to debate issues the way that they did in a certain generation, to hear like both sides out, is a major component of that. I suspect it has a little bit to do with the way that the stories are told, because if you watch Fox News, if you see the way they report these issues, it's a terrifying world, right? The cities are under siege. I'm originally from Portland, Oregon, and I have, you know, if you watch Fox News, it seems like Portland, Oregon is under attack by a militia group. There's like 5 people who spray painted on one building who are chanting, downtown for, most days. They've been doing that since the Occupy protest started like 4 years ago. But now it becomes this like Antifa group that everyone's like terrified of. It's like, it's comedic how fearful people are when the people who live there are like, oh, I didn't even know that was a story. Like, why would that be a story? So it's all presented a certain way with, I think to create fear. So I think the role of that, which is what a good storyteller does, honestly, like, you get people from the beginning invested in what you're telling them. If you say, there's been some property damage downtown, a couple people are mad about the president, nobody's watching that story, but, are you safe in your home? Like, can you walk down the street without having your car lit on fire? And then you're like, well, maybe I should see what that person says before I move on. So I think making these stories so critical to our daily life is one of the unfortunate trends, and we do it. And that's something that all political sort of effective, if you see effective by views, right? Like the really effective stories that are getting a lot of views, they get people to realize, even if it's not, true, but they get people to feel like this is my life or death here. And that's true on both sides. Like, right, this election, from the perspective of somebody who is very happy with the outcome of the election, it did feel like life or death, right? To have to deal with another 4 years of the blatant disregard for truth and science from the current administration, of course, was not something that would kill anybody directly, although you can make the argument that people being separated from children in cages and put in cages and stuff like that is murder. But I think, I felt this way, and probably many others felt this way during the Bush administration too. So we know that we can live through horrible presidents and that we disagree with on every issue, and it tends not to kill us. And yet it feels very much like life or death. And so that's something that, effectively, that's something we do effectively on both sides, because it draws people to be civically engaged. If we feel like this is going to save the life of your neighbor, then we're going to go out and we might march in the streets for that. But if we say everything comes down to a corporate tax rate, then nobody's in the street rioting and demanding justice for that.
All right. My question was, we in the USA have always mistrusted the Fourth Estate even more than we mistrust the people they write about. And that appears to be rooted in the yellow press of old, of the 1800s. Has there been any industry-wide move to secure better accuracy and trust? Question mark.
So I think it's the opposite. There's been less. I think we moved away from regulating journalism because of the move to digital. I think we've lost so many more journalists that, I mean, there have been talks about nationalizing like journalism, right? And having it be public funded, which is also troubling for those who look at state funded, journalism coming out of China and other countries where they are funded by the state. So I don't know what the answer is here. But I do think your question is true. Absolutely, journalism has always been cited as one of my points of my argument from the beginning, is that this idea of fiction or nonfiction is something we probably could move away from in this, whether something's fake news or not. These are stories, and they either speak to us or they don't. And so, like, is there a story of we want to get a pandemic under control, and we all make sacrifices for it because we want to save lives? Is that a story we're going to work towards? Or is the story going to be, we don't want anybody to control us, so we'll do whatever we want in a crowd because we want to fight for the individual's right, because this is one step towards being controlled by the state. Now, whatever story, when you get down to political stories, the better story usually, hopefully, if you believe in the ideas of democracy, hopefully wins. And that's the idea behind a democracy of someone, is that the majority of people will not be fooled all of the time. And so you see, movements forward and backwards. But I don't think there's any way to avoid there being a slant in the way the story is told, because having worked in the news, of course, if I choose to put in something into a story that makes somebody look better, that makes a difference. If you look at the press conference that was held yesterday by the administration next to an adult bookstore in a parking lot, then you look on, far right what I would say propaganda websites, they have a zoomed in really close, and you see all the backdrops, and it looks like a proper news conference. If you zoom out, 10 feet, you see the shambles of an incompetency that is unimaginable, that a president would hold a press conference in some random alley because they got the name wrong. And that's like the level of incompetence that is not obvious to someone who's looking at the zoomed in version. So does the journalist have some journalists will want to cover that up because they want to make their subjects look better. Other journalists will want to expose that. And so it does matter like who the journalists are for sure. And the trust that journalists have. I mean, you look at Brian Williams, a lot of his, trust was eroded from his, false memory about the helicopter, which is a little bit to do with the storytelling portion I was talking about earlier. But I mean, I see a question from Maria Gomez. I'm looking now about her favorite documentary, Frederick Wiseman. Is there anything less than an observational that's by definition bias? How can news with narration and storytelling be truthful? I mean, I would ask that question, like, I mean, truth is sort of one of those concepts that we hold firm on the left, that science matters and there's truth, but that's because we believe in science, right? If you have a faith-based view of the world and you believe that somebody can turn water into wine, that's not something like that remains true for you, whether you can document that with physical evidence for somebody else. So I think the idea of truth, this is to go back to philosophy 101 from all of our college classes, like truth depends on the listener and the teller. And so the dance that we make with those who tell stories to us and our role as audience members and creators of stories is to sort of untangle those for our own lives, because something that is, you can listen to astronomy, and if you find that your monthly astrological future is that you're going to have a tough time with communication this month, that could be laughable to somebody who says, there's nothing in astronomy that's real. And yet, if you spend that month paying extra careful attention to your email, paying extra careful attention to what you say to your friends and family, then for you it is true that that month, astronomy did make your life, is true for you in your life. So I think it's hard for people to tell other people what's true on a very basic level, because part of truth remains how we use it. And so we can get information and we can agree on information, but what that information means and that's why I think the role of the artist in society is so important, and is as important as the role of the lawyer or the lawmaker, because without beauty, truth doesn't have any meaning.
Sorry, and I have your book, and I would encourage the members here to take a look at it. It's really good.
Oh, cool. Thanks,
Yeah,
Ben.
I think all of us want to go out and read you said you have several books, so we'd like to read those, because this has been such an eye-opening presentation, I think, for all of us, that the juices of creativity that you've unleashed and also a rational mind on what's going on in our country. So if there's nothing that anybody else has, would anyone like to add anything, or do you have any questions?
I have a question. When the internet really became alive and a lot of newspapers were folding, there was this new phenomena called the citizen journalist. As a journalist, I resented them because I didn't feel that they were professional enough to get both sides of the story. But I want to get your take on that. That they were really valid, that they brought something to the table that the traditional news companies didn't do, that they were somebody that was, on the ground in the situation and, using YouTube or whatever to bring out a story. And my concern was it was always going to be biased because they weren't really going to look at both sides. Now, I might be in the minority. That's why I'm asking your opinion on that.
I mean, I think what we've seen, I think it's a good question. And I think it may be a better way to look at it is that they're not journalists, but they're just like documenting, citizen documenters. right? So if you have somebody filming the way a police officer interacts with a protester from 20 feet away, like that, I don't think that they're an effective journalist. They don't really know what they're capturing, and yet that, in the hands of a proper journalist, that video can tell a very different story or can challenge like accepted storytelling. And so I think I do think the ubiquitousness of cameras, going back to the initial work that I was doing on storytelling, where we would send cameras to people and have to sort of walk them through how to capture, what it was like to, depending on what the issue was. I mean, everything from what it was like to be a Satanist at a high school to be somebody who was on meth and not committing crimes but having to deal with that, or someone living with HIV. So some of the stories that we would really need to have that were hard to get traditional news outlets to pick up, because the stories themselves were either didn't fit with conventional ideas about a subject. So I think what we're seeing is, I do think it's a good move for society to have the ability for people to tell their own stories in situations where they would go up against a preconceived story that would be hard to break through. And so for people that feel like that doesn't explain my life, they can actually create something that is proof, or they can capture something that proves that. So if they want to tell a story, I don't know if that makes them a journalist. I think that gives them the ability to counteract some of the stories that were told about. And I'm thinking specifically of certain communities that haven't had access to education, haven't had access to training, and have been sort of the objects of a lot of stories about them. I mean, is there a problem? I think there is the problem, I would say, which I think is one that you highlighted about, the training, like, is that you can be overwhelmed you can be overwhelmed when you mix everything together. So it's sort of like if you had a pandemic and somebody was just freestyling, saying, well, maybe you can cure it by, inserting sunlight into our bodies. And so you put too much information out there that has no basis in reality. If you're, and that's the problem with irresponsible journalism, is they report on, well, this might be something for people to do. Maybe bleach cures this pandemic, and then people start ingesting bleach. And so you do see, unfortunately, information that can spread like a virus, right? So misinformation tends to spread like a virus worldwide. So then all of a sudden people now hold a really strong distrust of vaccines. And there's a number of reasons. You see that in South Korea, where they had to roll back the flu shot 4 months ago because of a batch of 200,000 vaccines was left and got to body temperature or whatever, and a few people got sick from it. And now they're having a really strong nationwide challenge to them trying to get people vaccinated for the flu, because people aren't trusting the government now because there was one batch that had this problem. So I think misinformation can be spread like a virus of the brain, and then it's hard to overcome that. So like you see that with the anti-vaccination movement here, where somebody's posting these stories that the science is not peer reviewed, and yet it's being looked at as well. Some people say vaccines cause autism, and some people don't. But really, the science shows that it clearly does not, and the non-science shows that it maybe could, because it's not science. And yet people are wrestling with that information because they're not getting it from a journalist who can properly put the non-science perspective. A couple people who have children with autism and also had their children vaccinated felt in their heart that there was a cause. That's different than there being proof, right? And so I think we live in a world where the personal narrative is so paramount to everyone's view that we're trained, I think, now to not shut down anyone's personal narrative. So if someone says this is what happened, we sort of expect to say, okay, well, that's what happened for you. And we're sort of reluctant to say, well, that didn't happen to you the way that you think it did, because that's not true. It's not possible. And I think that would be the role of a journalist, right? We even see that in the debates now, where the journalists are letting candidates say stuff that's patently untrue that they know, and they're not throwing it back at the candidate like, wait, that's not true. So I think this idea I hope that answers your question. I know it's kind of.
Yeah, well, I think it can't put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak. I think that the thing I was hung up on was the term journalist, but I see the value of people, who are witnessing police abuse, or anything like that. I mean, we wouldn't have had that before. Everybody has a camera. And so, it might be just me that's getting hung up on something. But I do see the valid, point you made is that we can know more now than we would not have been able to before. So thank you very much. Appreciate your answer.
And it's a trade-off for privacy, right? Like we have more information. We also have a younger generation that doesn't seem to care about being filmed all the time and having all their stuff documented. So I think these things change. And so some of these things are coming to light, which are good, but the way that they're coming to light, some people might find problematic. Like that there is a generation and there are members of the world that still believe not everything we do on our worst moments, potentially when we were 17 and drunk, should be documented for all time. And so we'll see how that changes the society we live in as well going forward. But the cell phone has just made camera documentation inevitably ubiquitous, and that's definitely a genie. It's not going back in the bottle.
I wonder if you have a perspective on how we can reach out to the half of America who does not agree with the election of the Democrats to the presidency.
I mean, I think the ones right now who are claiming that there was no fair election and it didn't happen the way that it actually happened.
But even when Joe Biden gets in office, I know he wants to create peace. What's the best way to do that is to try to understand them and try to incorporate them into our politics.
I mean, that's a good question. I think one thing is trying to find how, on an issues that we care about, trying to find a way to tell that story that lands with the values of the group we're addressing. Right? You look at the issue of drug policy, which is something I know quite a bit about. There was this story of compassion told on the left for years about people who were addicted to drugs. And that this was the main reason for overhauling drug laws, was because we felt like it was cruel to lock people up for life imprisonment for smoking a joint. Now, it turns out that the right is very receptive to this, but it's under the argument of this is a waste of taxpayer dollars. It's expensive to incarcerate somebody. It costs about $80,000 a year to house somebody in prison. And so why? So the story that was enacted on the left that was ultimately successful was to approach Republican governors and senators and council members and say, this is how we can save a bunch of tax money by legalizing and decriminalizing and creating, treatment instead of incarceration pipelines. And that really worked. So I'll say, I think it's a matter of finding the view of the world that we all hold, and sort of when we're honest with it, and saying it's not that, nobody sees themselves as the right does not see themselves as the racist party that, wants to be cruel to everyone. They see themselves as the protectors of free speech who can tell people the truth and not have to worry about hurting feelings. And this is very much at odds with the way the left experiences them. But if we want to convince them of our perspective, we say, well, don't you think we should have the right to, speak freely about science? Why should we muzzle scientists when they I thought you guys, so I think it's a matter of finding the value system and finding where something could fit in theirs, because I mean, the research on the left and the right over the 20 years is pretty clear that the right, they view the government as a way of a sort of traditional stern parental figure who lays down the rules and then lets people find out for themselves what happens when you don't follow them. And the left sees the role of government as a more sort of permissive and helping hand and mentoring figure in individuals' lives. And I do think there's a way to do it, but I don't think we're going to ever convince people that there's a right way to parent between those two models. I think that part's not going to happen. So when we try to convince people that this is the right way to do it, it's like convincing a parent the right way to get their kid to brush their teeth. It's just, they're going to do it the way that works. And we're not going to be able to convince them they did it the wrong way if it works for them. So.
Right. I heard that there's been common ground on the environment, where the environmentalists on the left But on the right, they call themselves conservationists, and they're much more comfortable with that term. But they're doing the same work, and so maybe let's hope that within the next 4 years we'll be able to achieve some of that.
And there's been a movement on the left to try to reach out to the right under this idea that there's this religious debt towards the earth that has been is part of their view system of what the earth is created for. And so I think like think tanks on both sides are looking at ways that they can kind of fit the puzzle pieces of their agenda into the existing structure of the belief system. So I think we just have to be mindful of how to reach out to those people we disagree with completely and just think about it from their perspective. It can be hard to do, it can be painful. I encourage everybody to take a look at Fox News once in a while if you don't ever watch it, because you will not recognize it. It will be, it can be, and it can be tough. And it's the same thing if they're, people only watch Fox News, take a minute to watch, MSNBC and just see like the stories that people are being told, because there's a reason why we're so entrenched. I mean, we're living in it is a different planet on Fox News. And yet, a lot of people live there. So we have to deal with it.
Well, let's hope we can all live together. And thank you so much again. I mean, this has been so wonderful. And it's, boy, a wonderful, wonderful presentation, Gabriel.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for